For 8 years, beginning in 1974, I had an office in the old State Library building, which is now the Patrick Henry State Office building. Office was a tiny little low-ceilinged closet in the basement of the rare book room. In that library, there was much less space for the storage of rare and precious and valuable books than there is in this library. So everything there was either extremely rare, extremely valuable, or unique. The room was locked, but we did have security. And the bookshelves had grates on them, and they were locked, so you couldn't just reach in and grab a book if you wanted. However, you could read the spines, and every time I got up from my desk in my little basement closet to go some other place in the library to do research, I would read spines as I walked along to see what kind of books were there. It was really intriguing, tremendous variety, some very, very famous authors, some very famous titles, some very famous editions. And then every once, now don't tell anybody I said this, every once in a while, when a librarian would come down and unlock a case and take out a book so that somebody else could consult it for research, I sneaked over and pulled a few books out and looked at them myself. Made me really jealous. I thought maybe if I get reincarnated, I'll come back as a rare book librarian, because it was a wonderful collection of books, absolutely fascinating, and including things that I would not have anticipated. After doing this for several years, I encountered one day a book that had this book plate in it. Now, I had seen pictures of this book plate before, and I knew, in fact, that the library had some detached copies of this book plate. But a book with that plate in it told me something, and it intrigued me. Told me that book had belonged to the government of Virginia way back in the colonial period, because this is the seal of the colony of Virginia. Virginia Council Chamber. There was a library in the Virginia Council Chamber in Jamestown until the end of the 17th century, and then in Williamsburg from the beginning of the 18th century until the government moved to Richmond in 1780. The more books I pulled off, the more copies I found of the book plate. I also found 4 or 5 books that had leather stamping affixed on the front cover, and it said Council Office 1742. And I found a few other books that had written in it, Council Office. So what was the council? What could we learn about the books by studying the council? What could we learn about the council by looking at the books? Well, in the colonial period, the king appointed a royal governor. The royal governor was the king's personal representative in Virginia and exercised royal authority here. At the same time that the king appointed a royal governor, he appointed a council of state, usually about a dozen of the wealthiest, most prestigious, best connected white men in Virginia. The council of state was the capstone of any Virginia politician's career. This was a lifetime royal appointment. It came with a salary, and it came with a lot of power. The council of state served as executive advisors to the governor. The royal governor could not act on matters of great importance without the approval of a majority of the Council of State. Beginning in 1643, the members of the Council of State were also the upper house of the colonial General Assembly, comparable in some ways to the House of Lords or to the Senate of the United States. And at the same time, the members of the Council of State served along with the governor as judges of the General Court. The General Court was the highest court in Virginia. It handled appeals from county courts. It settled all of the really important big cases at common law and in chancery that involved large amounts of land, large amounts of money, and big issues, and it was the only court in Virginia that handled trials of white people accused of felonies. So members of the Council of State exercised broad and very powerful responsibilities. They were executive advisors to the governor, they were the upper house of the General Assembly, and they were the colony's highest court. It's easy to understand that having all of those responsibilities, many of which were of a legal character, they needed a library. In particular, they needed a library of law books. Now, it happens that most of the members of the Council of State were not trained in the law. They were tobacco planters, tobacco merchants. They were engaged in large-scale commercial agriculture and in the international tobacco trade, which meant, of course, they knew the rudiments of business law. They knew about land law. They knew about all of the things that affected them personally. But in a large and complex society, it's very easy for a dispute between members of a family or between adjacent landowners or between a planter and a merchant to go to court. And these cases could become very complex and involve abstruse fine points of law, which people with a general knowledge wouldn't know how properly to settle. The members of the Council of State and the governor knew that the king required that all laws and legal processes in Virginia operate as nearly as possible the same as in England. Now, they knew that there were different circumstances over here, so they couldn't be exactly the same as England. But if a circumstance came up involving a disputed land grant or the interpretation of a will, this would go to the general court. They might or might not have a jury trial, but the judges of the general court would have to rule on points of law that the lawyers raised during the course of the proceedings. In order that they rule consistent with the laws and legal practices of England, they had to know what English judges had already ruled in similar cases. So they needed law books. Now, this need for law books actually predates the creation of the royal colony. You might remember that from 1607 to 1624, Virginia was not a royal colony. Virginia was a commercial outpost of the Virginia Company of London, which was a business enterprise. It was like a joint stock company. So the people who lived over here worked for the company. They worked for a business group. But even then, they could come into conflict. And they needed books. And they needed books of various kinds. There is a record from 1620 of someone in Virginia requesting that the company send a few books to Jamestown. They described it as certain good books of divinity. A large Bible, a book of common prayer, a book on catechism, and a small Bible richly embroidered. The next year, one of the members of the governing group in Virginia, a man named George Thorpe, wrote again to officials in London. In the matter of our government here, we are many times perplexed, sometimes for lack of legal officers, and sometimes for want of books. So he ordered from London a volume of abridgments of parliamentary statutes, 2 books that dealt with the settlement of complicated estates, and what other law books you shall think fit. So there were law books over here, and there were other books over here, even before Virginia became a royal colony. When Virginia became a royal colony in 1625, the need for law books in particular drastically increased, because now the officials in Virginia were not company officials, they were royal officials. They were exercising governmental responsibility. One of the things that's interesting is that they also requested, and we know that they bought, books of other kinds. One of the books that George Thorpe ordered in 1621 was called Gerard's Herbal. The Herbal, or General History of Plants, 1597. The reason he asked for that is because people in Virginia were experimenting with their natural habitat. They were going around and looking for plants that were edible. They were looking for plants that they might be able to cultivate and sell for a profit, like tobacco, or that had medicinal properties. And at that time, they would assume that any plant that existed in England and in Europe that had medicinal properties would also exist over here, because it was almost on the same latitude. And everybody knew if you were on the same latitude, the habitat and the climate were the same. Of course, what they knew was wrong, but it's understandable that they believed that. So they actually asked for books on botany as early as the 1620s. But with the creation of the royal colony and the appointment of a council of state, the legal responsibilities of that body increased radically and fast. I got so curious about their library that I stole a lot of time from my other work or came in on Saturdays when I wasn't supposed to be in. And I looked at every book that I could think of that might have been in the council library. And I learned that the library was large, that it was diverse, and I eventually learned that it had a very fine collection of legal books. Now, I found what I think is the only eyewitness description of this council library. Dates from 1773. Not very detailed. A visitor to Williamsburg reported that he'd gone and walked through the Capitol one day. In the council chamber, he found a large, well-chosen collection of books, chiefly of law. That's the only eyewitness description we have of that collection. So we work from other sources to see what we can find out about what was in the council library at the time the American Revolution came, because we have good reason to believe that the council had been purchasing books right straight through the 17th and 18th centuries to enlarge this collection. And there's pretty good reason to believe that it was a very, very fine law library by 1776. We know this for several reasons. There are a few records in the Council of State of the council actually ordering individual books by name and title. We also have a list from 1770 that was made out by some council members that is a list of books to be added to the library. Well, that tells us two or three things. That list is of books that were not in the library. And it's reasonable to suppose that books that are not on that list of comparable importance probably already were in that library. So I was beginning to be intrigued. Can we draw up a bibliography of books that were in that library? One of the other librarians found out about my curiosity and pointed me to this. This may be a unique imprint. 1828 printed catalog of the contents of the Library of Virginia, then called the Virginia State Library. It's almost identical to an 1823 handwritten catalog that is here in the archive. Now we're here in 2023, 200 years after 1823, because the library dates its founding to an act of assembly that was passed on this day, the 24th of January, 1823. That law provided for the first time for acquisition of books for the library using public revenue. Let me anticipate a question. If the 1823 law is the first law that authorized the purchase of books, where did the council get money to purchase books going back as far as the 1620s? Were they illegal purchases? No, they were not illegal purchases. We just have to stop and remember how different everything was once upon a time from what it is now. In the colonial period, the General Assembly passed laws to raise taxes and to spend money, just like they do today. But there were also another set of laws that raised money that was paid directly to the king. Customs revenue went directly to the king. Certain kinds of fines and other penalties were paid directly to the king. Every landowner paid a certain amount of money to the king. There was a tax on every pound of tobacco that was exported from Virginia. This was money that was paid directly to the king. The colonial government, the General Assembly, had no access to that money and no control over that money. But the members of the Council of State did, and they used money to buy books for the council library. We know that because there are 2 orders recorded in the council journals, and there's this list I mentioned from 1770 that council members drew up of books that they thought that they ought to buy. I had seen some books with the council library book plate in them, and I noticed that those books were listed in this 1828 catalog. First page of that catalog. And there's something about this that struck me. Notice, some of these books are identified as old. Not all of them, and not even all of the ones that were printed before the Revolution. But all of the books that I could identify from the council library are listed in the 1828 catalog, and they're all listed as old. So I thought, well, maybe all the other books that are listed as old were in the council library, even though they no longer exist. You know, books get lost, books get checked out and not returned, books wear out and get replaced with new editions. In the case of some law books, they become obsolete because particularly during the 19th century, Virginia and American law changed so far away from the antecedents of English law that some of the English law books were basically obsolete, no longer useful. So if they wore out, or if somebody borrowed it and didn't return it, they didn't replace it. But if we go through and look at all of the old books in the 1828 catalog, you get a really good sense of what was in the library in 1776. So I looked up every single one of the old books and increased the size of my library list pretty substantially. Mostly not even law books. This is one of the surviving law books from the council library. Deals with conveyancing of land, a real potboiler, I'm sure. But it was really important. I mean, published in 1651, library bought it new or almost new. It was a guide of how to do some of these complicated land transfers of the kind that almost all large-scale planters would encounter at one time or another during the course of their lives. This 1745 edition of the Book of Common Prayer is interesting in several respects. What is the council library doing with the Book of Common Prayer? Shouldn't that be down the street in the church? We also have a very excellent, extremely beautiful, very valuable pulpit Bible. It was published in the 1750s. It's got a really interesting misprint in it, and it's a very famous edition. There are not very many of them around, only a few score are known. It's called the Vinegar Bible, because in a typesetting office one day, when they were going through and setting all of this type, you know, character by character, space by space, piece by piece, somebody made a mistake. There's what we call running heads. If you remember, picture a book page, there's a page number up there, and then there's a little phrase that identifies either the book or the chapter. And in this edition of the Bible, nearly every verse is reflected by a running head on the top of the page. When you get over in, gosh, I forget which book it's in the New Testament, the parable of the vintner. Well, the typesetter Might have been to the vintners, because the running head is the parable of the vinegar. And the vinegar Bibles are extremely famous. They're one of a number of very amusing printers' errors or typesetters' errors that are found in early Bibles. Anyway, we have this vinegar Bible. And the vinegar Bible and the Book of Common Prayer both have the council bookplate in it. The Bible I wish we had is called the Wicked Bible. It comes from about the 1730s or 40s. And the compositor who was setting type when he was down in the Ten Commandments left out the word not from the one that deals with adultery. Well, that was a really serious blunder. The king ordered that that book be entirely suppressed and destroyed and burnt, and that the printer not be allowed to print another one. So that was, the Wicked Bible got that printer into a lot of trouble. Well, why do we have a Book of Common Prayer and a pulpit Bible in the council library? Well, this is another reminder of how things were different once upon a time. In colonial Virginia, and in fact up until 1786, the Church of England was part of the government. It was the established Church of Virginia. And the government was part of the church. Parishes of the Church of England had responsibility for identifying and caring for destitute and orphans, for identifying people who were guilty of moral offenses and presenting them to the county courts. They had a whole bunch of responsibilities that we in the modern times think of as purely governmental responsibilities, and it shouldn't be part of the church. But the church was part of the government. The government was part of the church. And as such, government offices, as well as parish rectorships and churches, had their own religious books. This Book of Common Prayer intrigued me from the very beginning. It's got red marks all through it, both on the cover to highlight decoratively and within the text as well. This is a very special book. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of straight red lines of ink in this book after it was already bound. But that's not the half of it. The spine of this book is stamped in gold with the letters GR. George Rex. That Bible almost certainly was in the household of somebody who was very closely related to King George II. Somehow, we don't know how, it got into the council library in Williamsburg, and it's still here. In fact, it's out in the lobby. If you go out in the lobby, there are two niches with glass cases. They're on the east side of the lobby, toward the cafe as you're walking in, and that book's there. It's unique. I mean, there's a lot of copies of the Book of Common Prayer, even of this edition, but that one is unique. And it serves as a good reminder, along with the Vinegar Bible, of the role that the church and the Church of England played in Virginia in the colonial period. Radically different than the role of any church in modern America, or even different than the role of religious and moral discussions that take place in American politics on issues that affect religion. So it's not just law books. What in the world is this? This is an 18th century encyclopedia, Diderot's encyclopedia. 17 volumes of text and 17 volumes of illustrative text. It's possible at one time that the council library had a complete set. We have a pretty big collection of these, some of them from the council library. This is the first time that people began compiling these huge encyclopedias of everything they knew for reference purposes. about law, about religion, about plants, about animals, about geography, about the natural habitat, and about the weather. And they're extremely beautiful. So the Virginia government bought this. We don't know when, we don't know precisely why, but it's a very special book. These illustrations are from one of the plates book, and it shows the work of Lumiere's, lens makers. So, making eyeglasses or microscopes or telescopes, a very complicated and technical and exacting manufacturing process. That's what a European lens maker's establishment would have looked like, and his implements and the various pieces of crystal on which he worked. This book's not in the council library, but I couldn't resist showing it anyway. It's the oldest item in this building. Jean Gerson's De Oratione. This is not even a printed book. This is a handwritten book, letter by letter, carefully written out on vellum and then bound. Sometime in the 1400s, somewhere in England. It concerns confessions and remissions of sin. It's the oldest item we have here, and I think the only book we have before the invention of the printing press. We have 4 titles. I don't think any of them was in the council library. We have 4 titles in the classification of books that are called incunabula. Incunabula, when printing was in its infancy and its swaddling clothes. Books printed before the year 1500. We have those here. Some of them are very, very scarce. Some of them are extremely beautiful. Some of them are very, very important, including a copy of the Nuremberg Chronicle, the first history of the world ever published. Gigantic book, about this big and about that thick. Published in Nuremberg, 1493, before news of Christopher Columbus's voyage had reached Germany. Fortunately, some copies of the Nuremberg Chronicle were bound with blank leaves in the back so that you could continue and complete the history of the world if you wanted to do so. Ours doesn't have the blank leaves, so it stops at the end of 1492. Here's another book. We got this in the 19th century. This is not in the council library. But after the 1823 law that provided for the first time for some money to buy books for the library, the Secretary of the Commonwealth, who then had the custody of the library, started buying things that interested him or that he thought would be useful. And the library has continued to do that up to the present time in order that we would have here copies of books of the sort that people in colonial Virginia, revolutionary Virginia, and 19th century Virginia would have consulted, would have read, would have learned from, or that they wrote and that they published. This gives us insights into the people of the past in Virginia. This is Ellen Smith's 1727 edition of The Complete Housewife. Went through several editions, including an abbreviated edition published in Williamsburg. This is the 4th edition, I think. But there's a long list of contents over there of the various things that you can do by the different months to make a soup. These recipe books from the olden days are really fun. You probably couldn't use them in your house because they will start off, 20 pounds of potatoes or a leg of beef, boil it down with some salt. So this is making a big pot of soup for a very large household, probably. We have things of this sort. We use them to learn about the past. They teach us about the people of the past. And the books that Virginians wrote teach us even more about the people and the past. Those of you who know me know that bird watching is one of my hobbies. So I'm very pleased to report that we have a complete first edition, all 9 volumes of Alexander Wilson's American Ornithology, published in Philadelphia from 1808 to 1825. I mean, this is a whole generation before Audubon. Audubon was the better artist, but Wilson was the better ornithologist. Wilson did experiments. He captured live birds and took them down and watched them behave, watched how they interacted with one another. He measured them. He watched them rear their young. His accounts of his scientific investigations of North American bird life are very, very fascinating. Of course, you recognize the top 2 birds are the northern cardinal, which is now the state bird of Virginia, and the bottom 2 are the scarlet tanager, male and female. Scarlet tanagers summer and breed here, but they fly down to South America in the autumn and then fly all the way back in the springtime. Very beautiful birds, very interesting birds. Some of Wilson's ornithological work he actually did in Virginia. When he was trying to get a specimen of the ruby-throated hummingbird, which is the hummingbird of eastern North America, he wrote to a friend and acquaintance, Thomas Jefferson, who was living in the White House, and asked him, who in Virginia can help me get a hummingbird? And Jefferson said, go try these people. And he did, and it worked. So the account of the ruby-throated hummingbird in Wilson's Ornithology is a piece of Virginia history. This is another piece of Virginia history that we didn't know about until just maybe, 30 years ago. This is a textbook. The conchologist's first book. Conchologist, that's the science of shells, shellfish. 1839. We have 2 copies. This one actually has hand-colored images. The other is printed as all black and white. What's nifty about this, though, is the author, a Virginian, Richmonder, Edgar Allan Poe, of all people. Struggling young man, needed to earn some money. Publisher hired him to take Thomas Wyatt's 1838 Manual of Conchology and condense and rewrite it for a school book, which Poe did. The only thing of the sort that he ever did in his life that any of us knows about. Got $50, which was no doubt very welcome to him in the 1840s. Anyway, we have that. It's an interesting Virginia association. It's also a very beautiful book. It's also something you would never expect Poe to have done, and it's not something that you would expect us to have. But we do. We have great stuff here. Books published in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century. Books that the Library of Virginia published from 1905 to about 20-something teen. I forget when we published our last book. We published enough books, bibliographies, periodicals, journals, finding aids, to fill a shelf 60 feet long. Much of that is still very, very fine scholarship. Some of it is obsolete because lists like the 1828 catalog of printed books were useful for me figuring out what was in the council library and how the library got started. But it's no longer useful for anybody who wants to borrow a book. We're online for that. But anyway, this is just a little bit of background about what we have, why we have it, how we got it, how we use it. There's hundreds of thousands of books in this place, hundreds of millions of archival items in this place. Goodness knows how many newspapers, maps, charts, works of art, business records, family Bibles, personal papers, corporation records. You could never go through all of it. I mean, I got retired 10 or 12 years ago in a budget gutting episode when they abolished my job, but I still come in here because it just come in here for free because it's fun and it amuses me to open up books, even like in the old rare book room when I wasn't supposed to, or to read people's mail or to look at the old newspapers and to try to figure out what I can about whatever strikes my curiosity. And every once in a while, I will stumble on an entirely new subject of research, like the council library. You know, a few people had written a little bit about some of the books that survived from that library and about the early history of the library's collection. But I think I'm the first person who ever tried to figure it out. I didn't go to graduate school with that in mind. I didn't come here to work with that in mind. I wasn't planning to do anything of the sort. But every once in a while, as people who work here will tell you, when you're walking down an aisle next to some books or boxes of archival materials, you'll hear stories trying to get out. And you just can't help yourself. You can't resist trying to help those stories get out. So that's what we do. And we take advantage of these materials as much as we can. And we keep counting. We're not through. Thank you for coming. If anybody has a question, I'll be glad to make up an answer or something.
Thank you so much, Brent. Actually, that was amazing. We're so glad that you listened to the stories and helped them try to get out. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and I will come and pass you the microphone.
We're recording this session, so we need to be able to get the questions to the people who look at it later, not just the answer. The most important thing is a good question.
Thank you so much. That was so very interesting. I do have a question about the illustrators. Do you have any information as to who did some of the illustrations?
For the conchologist book? I don't know. Somebody else might, but I don't. I don't know everything. I wish I knew more. I'm still kind of curious every day. I've enjoyed being an historian here for about 50 years, but you know, if I'd been a rare book librarian here, I think it would have been even more luxurious. Question.
Brent, curiosity has the best of me. How effective was the king's order? Are there any extant evil Bibles?
The Wicked Bible is the only one that I'm aware of that the king ordered to be destroyed. There is a whole book written maybe 75 years ago about mistakes in Bibles. It's a hilarious read. That's where I learned about the Wicked Bible. The Vinegar Bible figures in there, but there were several others. You know, you can't publish a book that big without something being wrong. It might even be something as, you know, so simple as in the early days, you know, where every single letter in a book had to be hand set with one tiny little piece of lead type. You know, it might be something as simple as putting the lowercase n upside down so that it looks like the lowercase u. Now, it's a more serious slip of the mind to set vinegar instead of vintner. But I mean, there's a lot of really good stories about the Bible or about the editions of Shakespeare and various other things. But the Wicked Bible is the only one that I can remember that they actually ordered destroyed. Other questions? There's a question up here at the front.
I had a question about other colonies. You have the history of Virginia. Would other colonies have done some of the same kind of thing as far as archiving books and whatever? as was done here.
I suspect they did because, you know, every colony had its own government, its own set of courts, and they therefore needed law books. Nobody knew that this library of the Colonial Council in Virginia was as large and elaborate and as fine as it was until I got curious about it. And, you know, I listened to the stories trying to get out. I don't think anybody has done something comparable for any other colony. I mean, there is some good scholarship on book collectors, private people, both in Virginia and elsewhere, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. One thing that's really interesting is that lawyers in Boston created what they called the social law library. They pooled their private resources so that any one of them could have access to a copy that somebody else owned. The library in the Colonial Council was open to the use of gentlemen. That's the word they used, gentlemen. Not just the public, not common, ordinary old riffraff like me, but what they really meant was lawyers, members of the House of Burgesses, and the judges of the General Court. That's who they collected the library for. I suspect that every colony had something of a sort, but I'm not aware, or I was not aware when I finished this research about 25 years ago, that anybody had done something comparable for another colony. And I'm not aware that anybody has since either, which is kind of, it's too bad because this helped us learn a lot, or certainly helped me learn a lot about the intellectual life of early Virginia. I mean, when I was in graduate school and started studying American history, everything about books, about religion, about the intellect and literacy was written from New England sources. The New Englanders were the ones who dealt in ideas. The Virginians dealt in tobacco. Well, we learn now from what we know about individual private book collectors in Virginia and about the book trade in Virginia and about this library that that's not so. Virginians, if they were wealthy enough, were well educated, they were thoughtful, they wrote about these subjects. Much of what they wrote didn't survive. That's part of the problem. But they can't have lived in a vacuum. Every court needed law books. You know, I wrote somewhere else once that the clergymen and the lawyers in the olden days were the ones that had law books. I mean, had books. A clergyman might need to say he just needed one particularly good book, but lawyers needed lots of books. They needed books on the common law. They needed books on land law. They needed books on criminal law. They needed books on how to argue a case in court, how to argue an appeal, how to try a convict. They needed to know, in particular, about conveyancing or transfer of property, because the history of English land ownership and transfers is amazingly complicated. Fortunately, in Virginia, the feudal backgrounds of English land law could be left in England because you don't have all these feudal rights and grants starting in the 17th century in Virginia, so they could disregard a lot of that. But even so, a lot of the institutions and practices and language from very early days in England still affected how law was administered here in Virginia. So, you know, they had to have old books to understand what used to be, and they had to have modern books to understand what it was. I mean, it's no different now, except lawyers don't have books anymore. They have expensive databases. These are good questions. I thank you for that.
Did Jefferson or any of the other early Virginia thinkers leave any of their libraries to this institution?
No, Jefferson sold, well, Jefferson had several libraries. His first library burned in a fire. His second library he sold to Congress after the War of 1812, when the British burned the Capitol and burned the library books there. So Jefferson's second library is the heart of what is now the collection of the Library of Congress. We do have 2 or 3 books that Jefferson owned at one time or another during his life. And I've handled them. You know, and we have books from other really famous and important people too. We have Patrick Henry books, we have George Washington. And it's really interesting. I will tell one story if I've got time. One of the things that I got excited about when I first looked through the 1828 printed catalog of the library is that there's an entry for Rushworth's historical collections. I actually knew what that was because I remembered reading Jefferson's autobiography, which he wrote very late in life. And he told a story. It's a really interesting and important story. He was a member of the House of Burgesses in May 1774 when news arrived that Parliament had passed the first of what they call the coercive acts to punish Bostonians and Americans for the Tea Party and other resistance to the British government. Americans called them the Intolerable Acts, by the way. Jefferson wrote in his autobiography that he, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and 2 or 3 other people decided to take the lead and push the old reluctant Burgesses to move forward faster than they probably would have. What did they do? They met in the council chamber for the benefit of the library in that room. Those are Jefferson's words, for the benefit of the library. They pulled a volume of Rushworth's historical collections off the shelf and rummaged through it and cooked up, I'm using Jefferson's word, and cooked up a resolution that they introduced in the House of Burgesses, and it passed. Well, I remembered that story about Rushworth. Here was Rushworth in the council library. I held the book in my hand, and then I noticed it was a different edition. Somewhere along the line, the set of Rushworth's historical collections that Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson and Richard, I mean, these are legendary people. They sat there and they looked through there. We use that, let's use that. They'd handled that book, but that set is gone. The edition that we had as early as 1828 was printed in a different year. So I didn't get to handle their book. But you know, this was an important event. In just 2 or 3 days, the call went out to assemble the First Continental Congress. I mean, you could say that the revolution started in the council chamber with a library book. That gets way away from your question, I'm sorry. There's a question all the way in the back. Oh, there's a question in the front too. Well, maybe we can take the front question while the back person
Tarter.
comes up.
What's the significance of William Waller Henning's work on the laws of Virginia?
If you have done historical research on Virginia, you already know the answer to that question. William Waller Henning was a late 18th, early 19th century legal scholar and court clerk in Virginia. He published a large number of really valuable legal works, including a great big manual for use of justices of the peace and several historical works. The most interesting, which was what Bill alluded to, is called The Statutes at Large of Virginia. And then the subtitle goes on for about 5 or 6 lines. All of the laws from the very beginning up through 1792. Many of those laws had never been published. He found copies in Thomas Jefferson's library. They were handwritten. He compared different versions of these laws and published this 13 volumes in the course of about, I don't forget, 15 years or so. And it's the most valuable one resource of its kind for the study of early colonial Virginia. It immediately became the go-to place for learning about early Virginia. We still use it today. It's still the authentic collection of the early Virginia laws, which deal not only with crime and land, but with people's personal affairs and many other things that you wouldn't think. And the reason he asked that question is that the 1823 law that provided some money for buying books for this library was a subvention to Henning to enable him to publish the final volumes in this set, with a stipulation that after the books were distributed to the courts, the proceeds from the sales of any of the leftovers would be spent to buy books for the library. So this, this is a really interesting link between the distant past that is treated in the documents that William Waller Henning published, Henning's own legal scholarship, and the first provision of public revenue for the Library of Virginia. And we actually have a descendant of William Waller Henning here somewhere he's written stuff on it. Yeah, Neil Henning, back in about 2/3 of the way back on the left. He's the handsome one, by the way. But yeah, that's a good question because, all these stories are interconnected in ways that's really interesting. It also makes answering a question difficult because it's easy to ravel off onto the intolerable acts in the Continental Congress when I get asked, did Thomas Jefferson give any books to the library?
May I ask you, when did the library accept its first books authored by a woman or by a Black person? Thank you.
I don't know either. I mean, we have the Complete Housewife, which is 18th century. I don't know when we bought that particular volume. And I don't know when we bought the first books authored by a Black person. I mean, this kind of research is really pretty hard to do because there's not a file in some librarian's office that's, okay, early Black authors, early women authors. And you can't always tell from looking at a book whether the author was Black or white or member of a First Nations tribe. And there are books, pamphlets, other things that were written and published by women very early on, and probably some by Black people that we don't even know they were Black. I mean, there's a story in there. Do you hear it calling to you? There's a good research project, or two good research projects there. I wish we knew.
I think we have time for one more question, if there are any other questions in the audience. All
Here's
right.
one. Thank you for good questions. I always am encouraged when people ask good questions. That means that they paid attention.
Let's say I wanted to look at the Edgar Allan Poe compilation, and I'm a citizen and I have a library card.
That's all you need.
That would be my access. What would I do to be able to sit in a room and look at that book?
Fill out a request to consult it. You have to make an appointment because that's in the rare book room. And we don't have as many librarians on staff as we need. So there's not always somebody there. But, if you're got a library card and you want to look at that book, you can look at that book. I mean, it's a public library. It's open to the public. If you look at that book in the rare book room, which is a beautiful research space on the upstairs, you might notice over in one corner, there's a whole series of shelves of books from the council library. About 25 years ago, we began a project to identify all of those books, put them in the rare book room, and do such conservation work as was necessary. Many of them, the bindings were split, or the covers were in trouble, or there were torn pages. And so we had those all professionally restored by what's probably the best restoration company in the country. And they're all on display there right now, except for the few that are out in the lobby. So yeah, if you want to look at Poe's book, you can do that. I have.
I think that's a wonderful wrap up and a testament to the work that not only Brent has done, but we're doing here at the library. So just another round of applause for Brent Tarter and his amazing work.